Hello everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and of course you're listening to the Property Podcast. This week we are finding out how to let a property yourself.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. This is episode 155. Like Rob says, we're talking about how to DIY it this week. This is actually going to be the first in a three-part series about lettings. We often get asked to do more of the nitty-gritty about lettings, and it's something we've developed some experience of over the last 18 months or so. So that's what we're going to do. This week, we're talking about how to let a property yourself, with lots of other bits and pieces along the way, as you'd expect, plus a very handy resource of the week to give you some ideas if you've got too much cash and you need to go and mix with other like-minded folk who also have a predilection for yachts and so on. So that's going to be handy for the majority of our listeners, I'd have thought.
I agree, Rob. Yep, it should be suiting everyone, this one. And now, we've just got our energy back because we've had a busy week. In fact, we've been working straight now for I don't know how many days. And that's because at the weekend just gone, we hosted not one, but two property summits. However, don't feel sorry for us because it was absolutely brilliant. The people involved in both days, and I'm not just saying this to be nice, were absolutely brilliant. So many different stories, and what I love, Rob, is not only does everyone learn from each other at these events, but we learn too. So many interesting things come out of the discussions, so many interesting concepts, different ways to approach things. And it's interesting, both days seem to have different themes. We had running themes throughout the days, but not the same each day. So really interesting for us to back two next to each other.
Yeah, definitely. Every summit we've done has been different because the content is completely driven by the people who turn up. And like you say, doing it back to back really emphasized that. And it's just so much fun to meet people who are so different, but are so motivated towards achieving what they want to achieve through property and going about it in such different ways. Occasionally we'll get emails from people saying, oh, I can't make a summit, but would you do like a one-on-one day? Or we had like a group of 3 people who got together and wanted to do it that way. And we always say no, not just because we don't have the time, which we don't, but also because the group dynamic is actually such an important part of the event. It's not just coming and listening to us waffle on for a day. It's learning from each other and benefiting from other people's experience. And we had a few people who came in thinking they wanted to do a certain thing, met people who had already been doing that thing for a number of years and thought, actually, maybe that's not for me. Maybe I should look at doing this instead. So it's quite a unique format. I'm not aware of anything else like this in property, and doing it at the weekend, yeah, it was exhausting, but the value to it I think was huge, and a lot of the value does come from the people who turn up, as well as from us spouting off as usual.
Yeah, and let's face it, we are good at that. So it was a great 2 days. Interestingly, we're going to do 5 in London this year. The first 2 we've done, the third one's already sold out in April. And we've just had to, because they're selling out so quick, release the 4th one, and then we'll only have 1 more after that, and it's done. So if you want to get into a summit this year, please don't see this as a pitch, because they are selling by themselves. But if you do want to, you've been holding off, maybe have a little look at thepropertyhub.net/summit. We're only doing 5. The first 2 are done. The 3rd's sold out. The 4th's been released, and that's already sold quite a lot of tickets, and that's in June. So if you want to get to a summit in 2016, bear in mind, we are saying this, what we're recording in February, then you may want to take action sooner rather than later. And someone taking action, Rob, was Matt Elder, who got in touch after the pension crisis episode. And I have to comment and say thanks to everybody who got in touch after that episode. Provoked a lot of feedback, and in a vast majority very positive and really nice to some of the things that people said, and appreciated the wake-up call. And people at the summit mentioned it, people have emailed me, people I've spoken to on the phone. So it seems to have had an impact, and I'm really glad, because I appreciate the pension crisis isn't sexy, but it seemed like we got the message across in that episode.
Yeah, it did seem to strike a nerve, which I'm really pleased about. If you didn't hear that episode, in the show notes for this episode, we'll link back to it. The show notes for this week are thepropertyhub.net/how-to-let. But one of the people we heard from who had a really interesting perspective was Matt Elder, who started his email, "G'day, Rob and Rob," which might tell you that he's an Aussie. And he was talking about it from an Australian perspective, where apparently they noticed in the 90s that they had basically exactly the same issue that we do here, and an aging workforce, people living longer, and the fact that no one was saving enough. But what Matt was saying is that they actually solved it effectively. They brought in something called superannuation, where basically everyone had to put 9% of their pay into savings, no thresholds, no messing around, 9%, actually now going up to 15%. And they're taking those funds and investing them in infrastructure. Basically, they've actually noticed a problem and had the political will to fix it. And the thrust of his email was, don't despair, it can be done. It just needs someone to grasp the nettle and actually point out, admit that there's a problem and do the short-term unpopular things needed to do to solve it. So I thought it was a really, really interesting perspective. And I was feeling a bit gloomy about the whole thing afterwards. It's like, oh, well, is anyone ever going to take the initiative to fix this? And Matt's email kind of made me think, oh, yeah, at some point, it will get to the point where someone will stand up and make the changes that are needed. So thank you. I thought that was really, really interesting.
It was. Thank you. And what else is interesting, Rob, is you found a graph to prove one of my theories, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, the news story, the proper news story this week is from The Telegraph. Again, the link will be in the show notes, thepropertyhub.net/how-to-let. It's a story about mortgage rates. It's about owner-occupier rates and how there's a lot of competition at the moment. They've fallen to a new low, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing is there's a graph in there that shows what's happened to mortgage rates since 2010. And you can see that the average rate has plummeted from something like 6.5% down to under 3% in the space of 5 or 6 years. And the base rate has remained completely unchanged. And the point of this is to give you a bit of comfort, because like we had at the summit, quite a few people saying, what happens when the base rate goes up? It will go up at some point. What should you do about, stress testing, worrying about affordability? And we were saying that, yeah, of course you should stress test. But if the base rate goes up 2%, that doesn't mean that mortgage rates will go up 2%, because competition among lenders is so important as well. And this graph just goes to show that even though the base rate has remained unchanged, the average rate for owner-occupiers has come down about 3.5%.
Yeah, it's quite staggering, this graph. Make sure you go to the show notes this week, which can be found at thepropertyhub.net/how-to-let, and have a look at this graph, because it really brings it to life. But 2-year fixed rate mortgages for 90%, so 90% loan to value, 2-year fixes, were about 6.5% 6 years ago, and now are under 3%. So they've not come down a bit. They've been absolutely slashed. And as Rob said, the bank rate hasn't changed. So really, really interesting graph. And as competition increases and as the banks want up their slice of the pie, it will get more and more competitive. So when rates go up, yes, there might be a temporary initial shock, but competition will kick in again and the rates will start to be driven down lower again. You have to only look back to the rates before the 2008 crash, and the margins the banks were accepting were in many cases less than 0.25%. So they're still making healthy margins based on what they're borrowing at, and I wouldn't be surprised if that graph continues to trundle down a bit further. Right, we've gone on enough about bits and pieces, but you're here for the main event, and that is how to let a property yourself. We've got 10 steps for you. We've got 10 easy-ish steps you can take to let a property. Now, of course, this is based on our own experiences, letting out our own properties, but more importantly, it's through our experience of running yellow lettings. We get an exaggerated view of portfolios because when we deal with our own portfolios, we learn, and we've been doing it a long time, so we've learned many lessons. But when you're handling and managing so many other properties, the lessons you learn are exaggerated. The mistakes are more painful, but the rewards are also more rewarding. And what you'll find is you learn a lot more quickly. So what we're doing is bringing that experience to you over a 3-part series. Next week, we're going to look at how to manage a property yourself. So we're kind of putting ourselves out of business by telling you how to let it and how to manage it. However, we want to share that knowledge. So if you want to do it yourself, you can.
Okay, so 10 steps. We're going to go through the process roughly in order. And this doesn't cover what happens when things go wrong. We're going to do a separate episode on that. We're just going to cover what you should do roughly in order to get a property let. So the first thing to do, obviously, is to get your property ready. So if it's a property that you've just bought, then it should be quite easy to look at it realistically and honestly. But if it's something that you've had for a while, then maybe you're not noticing some of the things that need sorting out. Maybe it looks a bit tired. Maybe it's got a funny smell. Maybe there are some things that need repairing. But any effort that you put into getting your property ready will pay off in a big way, because it might cost you a little bit of money to go through and give a couple of rooms a coat of paint. But if you didn't do that and instead you had to do viewings for an extra 2 weeks, the extra rent that you would have missed out on would far outweigh the money that you invested. So it sounds like a simple step, and it is, but it's not one to skip. You can't move the property to a better location. You can't make it bigger if it's a flat, but you can make it as good as it can possibly be. And it's really just about kind of treating others like you'd want to be treated. If you were renting, you'd want to live in the best place you possibly could that was clean and bright and everything else. Tenants want exactly the same. It's not difficult. It's just a case of putting in a little bit of effort and making it happen. So a very easy step to start off with, but one that you shouldn't miss out.
Another step you shouldn't miss out is researching the market. So you're getting your property ready, and before you advertise it, you want to do a bit of research. So what are properties similar to your own being marketed for? How are they being advertised? What's being mentioned? Look at your competition and see it as competition, because it is. Because those properties are trying to get let before yours. And the longer it takes for you to get yours let, the more money it's costing you. Check how long the properties are staying on the market at that price point. Are they moving fairly quickly, or are they lagging? And then also look, when you come to advertising, does yours have a USP? Has it got an extra parking space? Has it got an ensuite where others haven't? Or maybe you've just give it a refurb like Rob's mentioned. Try and find out what your USP is for that property. You might not have one, but if you do, make sure you take note of that, because it's going to make a difference when you put your advert together.
So number 3, having done your research, price competitively. And this is really important. There's a perception among people who aren't landlords that landlords can just charge whatever rent they want and tenants have got no choice about it. And maybe if every landlord in the country got together and agreed on what rent to charge, that would be true. But as that's never going to happen, you can't just pick some price out of the air, because tenants are not silly. They look at the market. If you think you spend a lot of time on Rightmove, most of them do as well, and they will know if a property is overpriced. They might come around and see it thinking, oh, maybe this will be brilliant and it'll be worth it. But if they turn up and it's just the same as something that's £50 a month cheaper just down the road, then you're going to struggle to get it let. It's actually been a real eye-opener since starting Yellow, how price-sensitive different markets are. Getting the right price is really important. And just like I was saying earlier, if you have a property that you struggle to rent out for a few weeks because it's a bit shabby, the rent that you'll miss out on will outweigh the money you would have spent. It's exactly the same when it comes to pricing a property for rent. If you're trying to get 50 quid too much and it takes you an extra month, then you'll probably, over the length of a tenancy, never catch up with where you would have been. So doing the market research and then picking a realistic price at the end of it, taking advice from whoever locally you think knows about these things, checking out your competition is really important. There's nothing wrong with asking for what it's worth, not at all, but there's no point being delusional about it. It will just cost you money in the end.
So following on from that, make sure your photos are top-notch. No, better than top-notch. Make sure your photos are brilliant, because the photos are basically going to make or break this let for you. It sounds dramatic, but it's true. If people don't view your property, then you can't let it. Makes sense, doesn't it? But what doesn't make sense to me and Rob and everyone else at the team is why landlords will accept really poor photos when trying to let a property. When I say poor, some of them are absolutely awful. Not only are they going to make it harder to let the property, but probably stop it. So make sure as a bare minimum the photos don't make the property any worse than it does. Make sure it gives it a decent chance. But actually, you want to go above and beyond that. If you can afford really top-notch photos to be done, then great, that's going to help, especially if you're doing this yourself. Maybe you'll pay for a professional photographer who will get the best lighting conditions and really make the most of it. Of course, photoshopping the photos is naughty, but if you can tidy them up a bit and improve them without breaking any rules or regs, then that might not be a bad thing to do. Be careful with that though. But basically, put the effort in, because you can reuse those photos. So if the property hasn't changed when you come to relet it next time, you've got stock photos for next time. So a little bit of investment, a little bit of time to get the photos right will pay huge returns over the long term.
So having done all of that, you've got a great property, you've presented it well, you've priced it accurately, well then the phone should start ringing. At this point, the next thing to do is to reply quickly to inquiries. Another real eye-opener from Yellow is how quickly the rental market moves. Generally, when people are looking to move, they want to move now. And also, they just want to get it over with. People are busy. And looking for somewhere to live is stressful, it's time consuming. For the most part, they just want to book a day of viewings, get it over with, get it done, and get on with their lives. So what that means is if you take a few days to get back to an inquiry, there's a good chance by that point you'll never be able to get hold of that person because they will already have found somewhere. So if you're doing it yourself, then yes, you're fitting it around work and your other commitments, but that doesn't mean you can just save up a week's worth, wait till the weekend and then call people back. Maybe you could get a PA or a phone answering service or something like that to book in appointments for you. Either way, get back quickly. Then, following on from that, if you're doing the viewings yourself, you need to be a bit of a salesperson. That doesn't mean you need to put on your shiniest suit and be really sleazy. It just means that you need to show off the property in the best light. Don't just kind of turn up, open the door and leave them to it. Actually point out the highlights. If you are letting a property yourself, this is a real strength because chances are you bought the property having done a fair bit of research into the area. Maybe you even used to live at the property yourself. That puts you in a good position to point out all of its benefits. And I actually did an episode of the Property Geek podcast where I interviewed a lady who specializes in staging properties for sale and for doing viewings. And she gave some really good insights into how to show off a property effectively in terms of presentation and in terms of viewings. So if you are looking at doing that yourself, I'll link to it in the show notes. That might be worth checking out.
Okay, point number 6, and it's probably a surprise that it's taken this long to bring in a system and a process, but review every week the progress of your property. So each week, take time to look at how many applicants you've had, offers, inquiries, put it all together and review each week. Now, hopefully, you hit the ground running and you get it let straight away. Fantastic. But if you don't want to just hope that your luck changes. You want to review this process. This is something we do at Yellow. We have a checklist for every single week that goes by. And you'll be glad to know there isn't that many weeks of checklists because we expect to get them let. But you want to be thinking, right, week 1, I'm going to do these things if it's not let. Week 2, I'm going to do these things. And, it's common sense stuff. You might be on to reviewing the rents after a certain point in time, and we'll talk about that. But there are different things to do, and make sure that you don't just let time pass, because what will happen is your property will become stale, and the listing will become stale, and then the inquiries will dry up. So this is something to take serious. Make sure that you're on the ball. Make sure that you're constantly reviewing the performance of your property, because if you don't, suddenly the inquiries will dry up and you won't get your property let, and then weeks turn into months, and then it turns into a disaster. So have that action plan, have a weekly review set with yourself, put it in the calendar. Maybe you can do some fancy automation where it reminds you to have a meeting with yourself, or maybe you've got an accountability partner who you can speak to. However you do it, it doesn't matter, but do it. That's the main thing. This tip alone is what most people don't do, but will make a big difference. So if you're going to take away something today that other people aren't doing that will make a big difference, this is definitely one of them.
Then, having done that, at some point, sooner or later, hopefully sooner, someone will actually make you an offer. Someone will come around and see it and go, yeah, perfect, I want it. Now, what happens if they offer you less than what you're asking for? Well, I've actually been surprised by how little people do this. People do occasionally try to negotiate rents, but in the vast majority of cases, people will just say, yep, I'll take it. And that's great if that does happen. If someone does offer you less than you wanted, then it is a negotiation. So you can, of course, if you've got lots of other people who are interested and are willing to give you full price, just turn them down. No problem. But it is a negotiation. So if they're willing to do some work on the property, getting everything drawn up properly, of course, maybe you discount the rent for that. Maybe you could offer to reduce your application fee instead of the rent. There are lots of things that you can do. Don't lose sight of the fact that it is just a negotiation between two people. And in any negotiation, the price is just one factor. Another big factor is time. So maybe if they're willing to move in more quickly, you could do something on the price. But really, it can be anything you want. At the same time, don't be afraid to turn people down. If someone is clearly just trying to be a cheapskate and you think that you can get it let to someone else, don't think that that first person is going to be the only offer that you get. It is clearly, you will not have missed the fact from the press that it is hard to find good quality properties to let at a good price. And so if you're offering a good property at a good price, you will never struggle. And I think that's why some of the earlier steps are so important. If you've got a property in a marginal area that's looking really tired, and the photos are rubbish, and so you're not getting many people through the door, then you kind of are at the mercy of that one person who turns up. But if you do everything else properly, then you are not going to struggle. And that means you can not only get it let quickly, but also stick to your guns and ideally have multiple interested parties, which means you can then pick the one that you think is going to suit the property best. And Rob, choosing the right tenant, of course, is massively important and probably not something you should just do based on a gut feeling.
No, you shouldn't accept a tenant if they've got a firm handshake and a trusting face. You should do a little bit more than that. And you absolutely want to be carrying out a reference check. There are plenty of services out there that will allow you to check the references of your prospective tenants for as little as, £20-30. And it is money well spent. Because if you get the wrong tenant into your property, it's going to cause no end of problems. This will be one of the best use of £20-30 you've ever spent, because it will give you the peace of mind that you've got a good tenant, or save you big problems ahead by warning you that the tenant you're looking at is dodgy. So be careful. If anyone's reluctant to be reference checked, that's a massive warning sign. I wouldn't accept them as a tenant. It's very, very simple to do. You can send them the links for them to fill out, so you don't have to fill out for them. There's plenty of resources online. We'll link to one or two reference agencies in the show notes so you can see for yourself if you want to do this process by yourself. But it's a must. This isn't an optional one. Well, it is, but it's only optional for idiots. If you don't do this, you shouldn't be letting a property because, as I mentioned, getting the wrong tenants in will cause you more problems than you can believe. Trust us, it's not worth the risk.
It really, really is not worth the risk. And another little tip, when you're speaking to tenants to arrange viewings, mention that you're going to be taking up references, because that might scare off people who know that the references are not going to come back well. Because actually going off and doing a viewing, it takes up an amount of your time. So if you're showing it to someone who's a bit of a chancer and then they just vanish as soon as they realise you're going to reference check them, and it does happen, then you've just wasted your time. So let them know early in the process that you're going to be doing it, and give some of the less desirable characters a chance to count themselves out instead of you having to do it. Okay, so you've done all that. You've done your reference checks, you're confident with your tenant, it's time to move them in. And at this point, there are legal boxes that need to be fixed. Funnily enough, on both days of the summit, a different person asked, is there like a checklist? Does the government provide a checklist of what you need to do when letting a property? And the answer is, well, you would have thought so, wouldn't you? But in fact, legislation is changing all the time. There's lots of different bits to it. If you go to the government website, it is all there, but it's hard to find, at least I haven't found, a proper up-to-date checklist of what it is that you need to do. Some of the most important things, right to rent. So you need to check their eligibility to rent in the UK. We've talked about this before. I won't get into it anymore because it makes me a bit angry. The next one is, again, something that came in recently, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. You need to have them, and you need to test them on day one to make sure that they are working. You also need to be providing the tenant with a whole bunch of paperwork. For example, if there's gas to the property, you need to give them a copy of the gas safety certificate. You need to give them a copy of the EPC, which they're always fascinated by. I've never had anyone ask me about the EPC ever. And also the how to rent leaflet, which is also entirely pointless. But you have to give them all this stuff. Some of these things, if you fail to do it, you can remedy it later, but it's far better to get it all done at the start. Otherwise, it could jeopardize your ability to get the tenant out at the end. And another absolutely crucial thing, we talked about this a few weeks ago, how it's been a requirement for, about 10 years or so, and still hundreds of thousands of landlords don't do it, protecting the deposit. If you're taking a deposit, you must protect it in one of the approved government schemes. And importantly as well, I didn't realise the importance of this fully until starting Yellow, you have to give the tenant the prescribed information relating to protecting deposits. Otherwise, it's pretty much as bad as if you hadn't protected it at all. So there's plenty to do. This is why letting a property yourself is far from impossible, but it's not something to just wander into thinking that it's easy. It's a point that I make in my book, is that a tenancy is actually granting a specific legal right that supersedes your own. Once you've created a tenancy, it means that that tenant has rights to that property over and above yours, and you need to go through a very specific process to get the property back again. So it means that you don't want to do anything at the start that jeopardizes your ability to do that. It also means that you don't want to stick just anyone in there. So all the things that we talked about near the start of the process help you get the right people through the door, reference check them to make sure that they're the right person, and then tick all the legal boxes to make sure you don't get into trouble later. It sounds like a lot. It is quite a lot, but it can be done as long as you take it seriously. And there is one final step that you should never, ever skip. And it frankly amazes me that anyone ever does.
Yeah, if you're still listening after all that legal stuff, thank you. Well done for getting to point 10. See, didn't say it was easy, did we? We just say we'll tell you how to do it. Number 10, very important, is carry out an inventory and check-in report. Again, crucial. Nearly as important, if not as important, as the legal stuff and the reference checking. Because if you don't acknowledge the state and condition of your property on the day you let it, when you take it back and it's been trashed, well, if you've got no leg to stand on, there's no way you can prove that it wasn't in that condition when you handed it over. So this is something you must do. And I think a lot of people who let their own properties, certainly newbies, I know experienced landlords probably do this, but newbie property investors who self-manage fail to carry this one out. So make sure you do a full inventory check and check-in report. Again, there are resources you can use online. There are apps for this. So there's no excuse not to do it. Some of the legal stuff, yes, is a headache, but things like the inventory can be made a lot easier through different apps and devices. So make use of them. Again, we'll link to one or two in the show notes to make your life easier. So if you want to go down that route, you can. But Rob, I think that's it. 10 points on how to get your property let yourself. If you follow them and do it well, you'll have a great experience. You will minimise many risks by going through what we've just suggested, those 10 points. However, if you don't, life can be made a lot more difficult. If you do have your property managed by someone else, you can use this checklist to make sure they're doing it properly. Because if you're paying someone to do a job for you, you want it done right. So make sure that they're using brilliant photos, make sure they're responding quickly. You can even test them by doing a little fake call. That's a sneaky one. You can make sure they're doing all the legal stuff, referencing properly. I'm sure they are, but now you've got a checklist to make sure.
Yep, so there you go. 10 steps for you. And then next week, we're going to be talking about how to manage a property yourself. And it'll become clear that if you do all these things, it makes everything that comes afterwards for the rest of the tenancy so much easier. If you mess up any of this, it's going to make your life more difficult down the line. So there's no reason not to do it yourself if you want to, if you've got the time and the confidence, but do make sure you do it right. So we mentioned a fair few links as part of that. You'll find all of them at the show notes for this week, which are at thepropertyhub.net/howtolet.
Okay, so before we give you our resource of the week and let you know what's coming up next week, we are going to read out our latest 5-star review. And a big thank you to Sad79, who says, I've recently subscribed, and as a newbie property investor, I found Rob and Rob's podcast very informative. Great range of subjects covered, and some practical tips and advice you can put into practice straight away. Highly recommended. Keep up the good work, guys. Sads. Well, thank you, Sads, and obviously that came with a 5-star review as well. We really do appreciate it. If you'd like to leave a review, please do. We like them. Makes us feel good, and we'll read them out on the show.
Yes, every one of those. Very much appreciated. So every week we have an iTunes review. Every week we also have a resource of the week. So this is one that someone mentioned at the summit. Then you watched it, Rob, and then I watched it. We just had a chat about it. We really should have had the microphone on, but let's do it again. What is it?
Okay, so first of all, a thank you to David Kidd. He was at the summit at the weekend and he recommended this resource. And I watched it that night and it was very interesting. It was a program on the Cayman Islands and particularly the tax regime of the Cayman Islands. Now, the Cayman Islands and other tax havens do get a lot of bad press. Is it warranted? Well, that's for you to decide. It's certainly not illegal, which the programme tries to hint that it is for a long time and then comes to the conclusion that it isn't. You can then go down the moral road, and that's up to you and what you think of it, and we're not going to tell you what you should think. We've got our own thoughts and opinions on it. However, I do find it fascinating. The problem is, though, if you do feel aggrieved by the tax regime and you do feel against it, the Cayman Islands stopping what they're doing is not the end of it, because there are so many other tax havens around the world. Companies would just move to another one, and there'll always be them, because there's always an incentive for countries to set up in this way. For example, we look at the Cayman Islands, but we don't even have to look much further than the Channel Islands or the Isle of Man to find tax havens. They're on our doorstep. So they're all over the world, but the BBC chose to focus on the Cayman Islands, which meant that the reporter got to go on very nice yachts and drive very nice cars and visit very nice places. I'm sure that was a hard campaign for him to take up, but it was interesting nevertheless.
It did make me laugh. There was one link that he did while parasailing. He does he sort of went up on this kind of on the parachute on the back of a boat, said a sentence, and then they cut to the next thing. It's like, why did you have to do that? Why was it necessary for you to be in the air to say that sentence? But anyway, I'm not going to go off on one about how much money the BBC is spending. Instead, I'm going to say, yeah, it is a very interesting programme, well worth a watch, and it's on the iPlayer, and we will link to it.
Okay, so next week we're following up, and the second part of this series is, as we mentioned earlier, how to manage a property yourself. So you followed our 10 steps. You've got a tenant. It's a great tenant, but now you need to look after them. What have you got to do? What are the legal implications? What efforts do you have to put in? We're going to find out next week.
Yes, we are. In the meantime, lots of links for you to go and follow up on at thepropertyhub.net/howtolet. Ask Rob and Rob will be back this coming Tuesday, of course, and then the Property Hub podcast back next Thursday. But before that, I think we need a day off, because we've been at this for such a long time now. If we're going to have a decent podcast next week, we need a little bit of a break. But thank you for listening, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.